this impasse if we simply let the House vote. Mr. President, I thank you and I yield the floor. And I suggest the absence of a quorum.
Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander.
And on the 7th day of the federal government shutdown, the Senate going to work on 2 judicial nominations today. That's about 5 o'clock Eastern Time. And they started the day with general speeches. They'll be taking votes on those judicial nominations at 5:30. Harry Reid started things off in the Senate. He called on Speaker Boehner to bring up a bill that's in the House to fund the government without any attachments. That's the clean continuing resolution. And both chambers were in this weekend. The House worked on a bill for back pay for federal government workers who've been furloughed because of the shutdown. That bill is in the Senate awaiting action. But we're going to take a look now at some of the House action on that bill from when they were in this weekend.
To concern. Mr. Speaker, I rise in strong support of the concurrent resolution offered by my colleague, Representative Doug Collins of Georgia, a dedicated chaplain and Iraq veteran of the United States Air Force Reserve. His resolution goes to the heart of our constitutionally guaranteed ability to worship with
all over this country. The American people are outraged by what's going on here in Washington. They have a hard time understanding why right-wing extremists in the Republican Party in the House are able to shut down the United States government, deny paychecks to millions of federal employees, and at the same time threaten services, in some cases desperately needed services, to tens of millions of Americans. So the people are hurting and they wonder what's going on. Let me just try to say a few words as to my views as to, in fact, what has happened. For a beginning, when some of my Republican colleagues are saying, well, we just need to talk, let's compromise, a key point they neglect to make is that a major compromise has already taken place. The Democrats in the Senate, and I'm an independent, as you are, affiliated with the Democratic caucus, decided to send a budget for a continuing resolution to the House, which, in my view, was a very, very weak budget, one that I am totally dissatisfied with, and I think most members of the caucus are. It continues the budget at sequestration levels, which will have a devastating impact on this country. It is a bad budget. But the reason that the majority leader sent it over to the House was that he was under the understanding that the Speaker of the House had requested that type of budget, and that once that budget came over, that CR came over, that the House would agree to it. In fact, let me read from an article in the Washington Post today, commenting on an ABC interview that Speaker Boehner did. And the Washington Post says, in the ABC interview, Boehner tacitly acknowledged making a deal with Senate Democrats to avoid using the threat of a shutdown to attack Obamacare in exchange for an agreement to maintain the deep cuts known as the sequester through the fall. He conceded that his rank and file forced him on to the path to shutdown by insisting on waging the fight over Obamacare, end of quote, Washington Post today. Well, what does that mean? It means that an agreement had been reached by the Speaker and the Majority Leader that if the Democrats accepted the very low budget that the Republicans wanted, that there would be a clean continuing resolution. And what this article points out, and what I think the Speaker has virtually acknowledged, that despite his agreement with the Majority Leader here in the Senate, he couldn't carry it out because his extreme right wing said, well, thanks, you got us the budget that we wanted, the CR that we wanted, that's not enough. Now we want to end Obamacare. And that's where we are today. So anyone who comes forward and says, well, why don't you talk? Why don't you compromise? The fact of the matter is, and I think the Majority Leader has made this point, that he compromised far more than many of us felt comfortable with. A compromise has already been reached. The Democrats accepted, in my view, a very bad and weak Republican budget. but it was done with the hope and the understanding that there would be a clean, continuing resolution and that the United States government would not be shut down. That's point number one. Point number two is the Speaker the other day on TV said there are not the votes to pass a clean CR. Well, what I have been hearing here on the floor of the Senate and in the House is that you have Republicans who are not sympathetic to Obamacare. They don't like Obamacare. They would like to defund Obamacare. But they understand that you don't shut down the United States government. You don't threaten that for the first time in the history of the United States, we may not pay our bills, be a deadbeat nation, and drive our economy and our financial system and perhaps the entire world's financial system into a catastrophic area by not paying our bills. And we believe that, in fact, there are enough Republicans in the House to join with Democrats and, in fact, pass a clean CR. I think the President has made the point, and the Majority Leader has made the point, is have the vote. Have the vote, Mr. Speaker. And maybe you're right, maybe you're not, but we don't know until you have the vote. And I would urge, as I have before, that the Speaker of the House function as the Speaker of the United States House of Representatives and not as the Speaker of the Republican Party. The last point that I want to make touches on an article that appeared in yesterday's New York Times. And it's a very important article because it really tells us who is behind this shutdown and what their motives are. If anybody thinks that this government shutdown or the threats about not paying our bills and driving the world's economy into catastrophic areas, thinks that this is an idea that just occurred the other day, that a senator had this bright idea, you would be very, very mistaken. The fact of the matter is that we have a growing right-wing movement in this country funded by some of the wealthiest people in America, including the Koch brothers, a family that has made their money in fossil fuels and are worth over $70 billion. $70 billion is their worth. And they are worth $70 billion. They have access to the best health care in the world. They have access to the best housing in the world. Their family members can go to the best colleges and universities in the world. But they are obsessed by, among other things, making sure that 20 or 25 million Americans have no health insurance at all. Now, I am a strong supporter of a Medicare for All single-payer program. I don't think that the Affordable Care Act went far enough. But to say the least, that when 20 or 25 million Americans can finally have access to health insurance, go to the doctor when they need to go to that doctor, make sure that there are no regulations that prevent them from getting care because of pre-existing conditions. Can you imagine, Mr. President, billionaires going to war against working people so that they and their kids cannot get health insurance? I mean, I think that is just obscene. That is just obscene. So let me just quote from the New York Times of yesterday. And it's important that people understand that the fight against the Affordable Care Act really is just the tip of the iceberg. That you have families and billionaires like the Koch brothers who not only want to see that we don't expand health insurance in this country, they have a long list of issues that they're going after. In fact, they want to repeal virtually every major piece of legislation passed in the last 80 years that protect the middle class and working families, women, children, the elderly, the sick, and the poor. That is their agenda. That is their agenda. So it's not a question of opposing the extension of health insurance through Obamacare. That's not enough for them. What they want to do is end Medicare as we know it right now, transform it into a voucher system, give an elderly person $8,000 who's dealing with cancer and say, good luck to you. They want to make massive cuts in Medicaid. They don't want to expand Medicaid, massive cuts. They are very clear about wanting to end Social Security. They don't believe the federal government should be involved in retirement issues and Social Security. One of the more amazing things of what these guys want to do, and many of our Republican colleagues apparently have drank the lemonade on this issue, is they want to abolish the concept of the minimum wage. Minimum wage now federally is $7.25 an hour. People can't live on that. And their idea is to get the federal government out of the minimum wage issue, no floor, so that if an employer in a hard-pressed area in Maine or in Vermont or in Michigan can pay people $4 an hour, they think that's freedom. You have the freedom to work for $4 an hour. We don't want a federal minimum wage. So in other words, what these right-wing extremists and the big money behind them, they have a major agenda of which repealing Obamacare is just one small part of it. Let me just quote, if I might, and I would ask unanimous consent, Mr. President, to submit the entire New York Times article into the record.
Without objection.
Thank you. Let me just quote from the article, yesterday's New York Times. The current budget brinksmanship is just the latest development in a well-financed, broad-based assault on the health law, Mr. Obama's signature legislative initiatives. Groups like Tea Party Patriots, Americans for Prosperity, and Freedom Works are all immersed in the fight, as is Club for Growth, a business-backed nonprofit organization. Some, like Generation Opportunity and Young Americans for Liberty, both aimed at young adults, are upstarts. Heritage Action is new, funded in 2010 to advance the policy prescriptions of its sister group, the Heritage Foundation. The billionaire Koch brothers, Charles and David, have been deeply involved with financing the overall effort. Let me repeat that. The billionaire Koch brothers, Charles and David, have been deeply involved with financing the overall effort. Remember, these are the guys who are worth $70 billion, who want to essentially repeal every major piece of legislation protecting working families over the last 80 years. And let me go back to the article. Quote, a group linked to the Kochs, Freedom Partners Chamber of Commerce, dispersed more than $200 million last year, $200 million last year, to nonprofit organizations involved in the fight, et cetera, et cetera. Now, I want to go to another paragraph, and this is really interesting and really important. The groups have also sought to pressure vulnerable Republican members of Congress with scorecards keeping track of their health care votes, have burned faux Obama cards on college campuses, and have distributed scripts of phone calls to congressional offices, sample letters to editors, and Twitter and Facebook offerings for followers to present as their own. What's going on here? What does that mean? This is what it means. As a result of the disastrous Supreme Court ruling called Citizens United, what billionaires like the Koch brothers and others can do, and what they are doing today, is saying to Republicans in the House of Representatives, if you vote for a clean continuing resolution, if you vote to keep the government open, if you make it very clear that you will oppose any effort to see the United States default on its debts, if you do that, let me tell you what's going to happen to you. Because we have the Koch brothers and people worth billions of dollars who are prepared to jump into your campaign, perhaps to get a primary opponent against you and to fund that opponent with as much money as he or she needs. So what democracy now in the House, as a result of Citizens United, is about is a handful of billionaires can threaten any member of the House with defeat by pouring in unlimited sums of money if they vote in a way that the Koch brothers do not like. Now, if that's how people think American democracy is supposed to function, it would surprise me very much. That's not what American democracy is supposed to be about. And, Mr. President, that tells me again why we have got to do everything that we can to overturn this disastrous Citizens United Supreme Court decision so that a handful of billionaires cannot dictate public policy here in the United States of America and in the United States Congress. Let me just conclude, Mr. President, by saying this. The American people are angry and they are frustrated, and I think what they are seeing is that the middle class of this country is disappearing. In fact, in the last 24 years, median family income today is lower than it was. It's gone down. You have millions of people who are out there working for wages that they just can't raise a family on. You're seeing right now a growth in poverty among elderly people. And in the midst of the disappearing middle class and in the increase of poverty, you are seeing more income and wealth inequality in this country than we have seen since the 1920s. Gap between the very rich and everybody else goes wider. And now, as I mentioned a moment ago, what these billionaires are doing with their money is continuing their war against the middle class by trying to repeal important pieces of legislation. And what the American people are saying, what about us? What about us? Who is worried that my kid who graduated high school can't find a job? Who is worried that my other kid who graduated college is leaving school deeply in debt? Who is worried that in our country we are not being aggressive in dealing with the issue of global warming? There are enormous issues facing the middle class in this country. The need to create millions of jobs, the need to raise the minimum wage, the need to make college affordable, the need to significantly improve child care in this country and education in general. There is an enormous amount of work to be done. What this Congress should not be doing is telling 2 million workers that you're not getting paid, furloughing what was then 800,000, now 400,000 workers. That's not what we should be doing. So, Mr. President, I hope that the American people stand up and make it clear to our Republican friends that they cannot shut down the government because they are not getting their way. And I would hope the American people would do everything they can to demand that this Congress start doing its job, which is to represent working families in this country. And with that, Mr. President, I would yield the floor and note the absence of a quorum.
Clerk will call the roll. Mr. Alexander. Senator from Ohio.
Thank you, Mr. President. I ask unanimous consent to dispense with the phone call.
Without objection.
And to speak, ask unanimously to speak for up to 10 minutes as if in morning business.
Without objection.
Thanks, Mr. President. I rise today with a pretty simple message for House leadership. You can end this Republican shutdown today. Just simply let the House vote on issue after issue after issue. When the House has acted, the Senate has responded with a vote to either table a motion or vote a motion for or against, or vote legislation for or against, but taking a vote. We simply ask the House to do the same thing. By scheduling a vote on the Senate-passed plan, a continuing resolution, Speaker Boehner can ensure that more than 800,000 workers, including tens of thousands in my home state of Ohio, can get back to work. By scheduling a vote on the Senate-passed bill, he can reopen the government without rehashing old political fights, then get down to business, deal with the debt limit, then get down to business and make decisions about immigration, make decisions about jobs, make decisions about what we're going to do with the budget. We've never, I don't think we've ever, Mr. Speaker, seen one faction of one party, of one chamber, of one branch of government hold the entire country and economic recovery of our nation hostage. One faction of one party, of one house, of one branch of government hold the country hostage. Don't take my word for it. The Cleveland Plain Dealer headline said Republicans need to quit the attack on Obamacare and agree to a clean, continuing resolution. They called the action of the far-right attack on the 3-year-old health care law, the health care law that was passed overwhelmingly in both houses, 60 votes in the Senate, well over a majority in the House, affirmed in part by the Supreme Court. The Plain Dealer called the actions attacking the health care law bordering on the un-American. The Toledo Blade called the actions of the far right in the House GOP extortion, challenging Speaker Boehner to put America's economy over his own job, reminding him of his election night, saying the 2012 election changes that, making the health law the law of the land. Finally, the Washington Post, no stranger to criticizing Democrats, called out the House of embarrassment and its heedlessness on the impact of its actions on ordinary Americans. I was home this weekend, and I spoke with all kinds of people. I spoke with federal employees, some of who had been furloughed, some haven't. I spoke with others in Avon Lake, Ohio, other places, and listened to what they had to say. And people are frustrated. They can't believe that again, one house, one group of radicals in one house of the government, of one branch of government, can, for all intents and purposes, shut the country down and move us towards the precipice on what happens if the United States Congress does not pay the bills that we as a Congress ran up. These are real people facing a real and devastating impact. Mr. President, I did something else that I know you, as a senator from Maine and former governor, do also. Get on the phone and just talk to people in your state about the impact that this will have. I spoke to one of the leaders at an institution in Ohio that has a large R&D presence in the state. He talked about the irreparable damage to our infrastructure, similar to what happens in Senator Nelson, who just joined me on the floor, Senator Nelson's state, what can happen at NASA in South Florida, what happens at NASA in Cleveland, what happens at Battelle in Columbus, what happens at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base in Dayton. He talked about this leader in one of these institutions, I don't want to call him out by name, talked about the irreparable damage to our infrastructure as a nation. This isn't just highways and bridges. This is scientific researchers. This is engineers. This is people working on some of the most top secret things in our country and our government. And he went on to say it's asymmetric, killing and building a scientific endeavor. Think about that. Killing a scientific endeavor, you can do in a week or you can do in a month simply by stopping the research, by an interruption like this where many of the top scientists, the top engineers, at some point just say, I don't want to go through this again. I'm not going to continue to do this important work for my country, and then see it shut down because somebody has a political axe to grind, because somebody on a continuing resolution or one political party, as we approach the debt ceiling, wants to attach their political platform to one of these important pieces of legislation just to make the government run. And what's happening in places like that is some of these engineers say, I'm not sure I want to work for NASA anymore. I'm not sure I want to stay in the military. I'm not sure I want to be at a major research institution like Battelle. I can go elsewhere where my work won't get interrupted and people will show their appreciation simply by continuing to fund my research. And when you think about this, killing and building a scientific endeavor, it's a little bit like one old politician said about, it takes a carpenter to build a barn, but I'm not sure he used the word mule, but it takes a carpenter a long time to build a barn, but any mule can knock down that barn in a day or so. I remember I was in a car accident years ago, broke my back, was in the hospital for a week. For 3 days I stayed in bed, and I remember the first time I tried to walk, how my muscles had atrophied. And it took several weeks before I was back to full strength and can rebuild that muscle. And that's really the way it is with these research institutions that our country has so many of that are so important, whether it's NASA, whether it's Battelle, whether it's Wright-Patt Air Force Base, whether it's the National Institutes of Health. We have assembled some of the greatest scientists and engineers and technicians in the world at these institutions. But building a scientific endeavor takes days and weeks and months and years. Killing one is a matter of an interruption of 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 weeks. That's why this is so dangerous, this shutdown. That's why going up against the debt ceiling is potentially catastrophic for our country. It makes no sense. It's not good for our economy. It's not good for our people. It's not good to have a federal workforce that really can do the right kinds of things for our country. I'd be glad to yield from Florida.
What the senator said about NASA is so true. Here, 97%, would the senator believe, 97% of the workforce at the National Aeronautics and Space Administration is on furlough. And a few of us had to intercede the Mars mission that is supposed to go in a narrow window between mid-November and early December. If they missed that window, it would be another 2 years before they could launch that Mars mission, and therefore all the expense of keeping the scientists on and so forth. We finally got them to bring them back so they could continue processing the mission so that it can launch in that narrow 3-week window. But the rest of the people are gone. Does that sound very intelligent to the senator?
Well, Dad, it's interesting. 3 of the great NASA facilities are represented on the floor now, Senator Cornyn from Texas and Senator Nelson and I. And it's not just NASA employees at NASA Glenn in Cleveland. It's another 1,300 contractors who are doing work, paid by taxpayers, they're actually private companies, as you know, the same in Florida, the same in Texas, and how important their work is, too. And I just think that these kinds of interruptions are so senseless. What I heard when I was home from people more than anything is how senseless this is, how ludicrous it is. I spoke to hospital administrators all over my state today. I was on the phone with a number of them, and from Williams County in the northwest corner to Columbus to Cleveland to all over, and it's senseless to them that they are in the midst of maybe a hospital expansion or maybe just the day-to-day work of the hospital, and they don't know what to think. And I hear many of my colleagues here for years talk about the unpredictability of this economy and partly because of Washington and Obamacare or maybe Dodd-Frank, and we don't know what's happening next. The worst kind of unpredictability is shutting the government down or leading us right up to the debt ceiling, and that's why, Mr. President, it's so important that the House vote, and then we get serious about doing the debt ceiling vote, and then we move on to issues like immigration and issues that matter for our country. Mr. President, I yield the floor.
Senator from Texas.
Mr. President, I agree with our colleagues that government shutdown is not the best way to do business around here, and we should get together, the President, the House, and the Senate, and we should work this out. Both the continuing resolution and the debt ceiling, which Secretary of the Treasury Jack Lew has said he will basically run out of all of the extraordinary measures he can use to avoid us reaching the debt ceiling, which, colloquially speaking, I would say is the equivalent of maxing out your credit card, the federal government's credit card. But it's worth remembering that as James Baker, former Secretary of the Treasury, Secretary of State, with a distinguished record of public service going back many, many years, he recently noted in an article in the Wall Street Journal that since 1976, we've had 17 government shutdowns temporarily until differences between the parties, between the branches could be worked out. And I hope that we can do that sooner rather than later. The truth is, there was a way out with regard to the shutdown, particularly when the House passed a piece of legislation that would maintain the spending limits at $988 billion, which was the same level the Senate majority had chosen. But it also attached two other provisions to it. One which would have eliminated the carve-out for Congress for Obamacare. In other words, the carve-out that treats Congress differently from the rest of the country. And our Democratic friends voted uniformly against that provision. All Republicans voted to eliminate that carve-out. And the second was the delay in the penalties that would be applied to individuals that don't buy government-approved health insurance under Obamacare. Now, the President has unilaterally delayed for a year the penalties for employers who don't meet the requirements of Obamacare, and all we were asking for is give the same consideration to average, hard-working Americans. If our friends across the aisle, or at least enough of them, had joined with us to vote for both of those provisions that came over with the House bill, the government would not be shut down. It would be operating, but that was the decision they made, and I think they made a mistake. But we know the government shutdown debate has now quickly become a debate over the broader subject of what do we do about spending and debt. And particularly, what do we do with regard to the debt ceiling I mentioned earlier? We've reached almost the top of our credit limit on the nation's credit card, and President Obama is asking for another $1 trillion in spending, in debt limit. But the President differs from many of us, and he thinks this debt ceiling cap ought to be lifted by another $1 trillion without anything else attached to it. He thinks it ought to be automatic, even though we believe it's entirely appropriate and has the majority of times in the past the debt ceiling increase has been accompanied by other long-term policy reforms. The President himself has agreed to those kinds of reforms in the past, but apparently for some reason this time has drawn the line in the sand. So now he believes, unlike the past, that Congress should act like a rubber stamp when it comes to raising the limit on America's credit card, our debt limit. Meanwhile, it seems that our friends across the aisle also feel that the House should be a rubber stamp for the Senate. All of which leads me to conclude, Mr. President, that James Madison, the father of our Constitution, must be rolling over in his grave, because he and others of the founders were the geniuses who decided that it was the checks and balances from separated government, the executive and the legislative, the House and the Senate, that would best protect our freedoms and best prevent overreach by other branches. But in a way, I can understand why the President and the Majority Leader are refusing to negotiate and saying it's my way or the highway. After all, the last time we had these kinds of major fiscal talks in advance of a debt ceiling deadline, the result was the Budget Control Act. Now, that was 2011, a law that produced, by default, real spending cuts and real deficit reduction. You'll recall that was where the super committee was created to try to negotiate a grand bargain. Super committee was unsuccessful, and the default was the Budget Control Act and the sequester, which automatically cut discretionary spending. Now, our friends across the aisle clearly think that that was a big mistake, and the President and the Majority Leader now are refusing to negotiate at all on the debt ceiling and believe it ought to be rubber-stamped. Well, amidst all the rhetoric and the finger-pointing, and now Washington has erupted into something it does best, which is the blame game, I'm afraid that we've lost sight of our underlying debt problem. Despite the short-term deficit reduction we've witnessed since 2011 due to the default position of the Budget Control Act, our long-term fiscal trajectory remains unsustainable. Last month, the Congressional Budget Office projected that publicly held federal debt is on course to exceed the size of our entire economy. By that point, again, under current law, the interest that we have to pay to China and other foreign creditors that hold more than half of our debt will be 2.5 times greater than the 40-year average. We know now that interest rates are extraordinarily and abnormally low because of the policies of the Federal Reserve. But can you imagine that for that $17 trillion in debt, that the U.S. government would have to pay historic averages of interest to our creditors in order to get them to buy our debt? What impact that would have? Well, I'll talk about that more in a moment. But if we continue down this road without adopting real reforms for our long-term fiscal challenges, then we are condemning our children and our grandchildren to less jobs, slower economic growth, worse opportunity, and much greater risk of a full-blown fiscal crisis. In the event of a crisis, our safety net programs that we all care about for the most vulnerable in our country, those would be cut harshly and abruptly, as would our ability to fund national security and other priorities. Now, nobody wants that kind of future, and nobody has to accept that kind of future if we would just do our job. Not the President trying to go it alone again, not the Senate saying it's my way or the highway to the House, but by the House and the Senate and the White House working together to try to work our way through it. But if we continue to rack up debt, another $1 trillion is what the President wants to raise the debt limit, and if we continue to postpone the hard choices and leave it to others, we're moving closer and closer to an eventual disaster. By contrast, if we were to take the responsibility now to reform our safety net programs, we can reform them gradually so that people would barely feel it. That would make it much easier to protect the Americans who need these programs the most, our seniors, and as I said, the most vulnerable in our society. Of course, we can't make any real progress as long as the President and the Majority Leader and the Senate refuse to negotiate. As I said earlier, Congress is not a rubber stamp. That's not a Constitution written by our founders. And the House of Representatives is not a rubber stamp for the Senate. Now, we've been willing to compromise and negotiate. Matter of fact, the House has sent over multiple bills. Every time a member of the opposing party comes to the floor and talks about NIH, the National Institutes of Health funding being cut off for children's cancer research, we've come down here and said, well, let's pass that bill. Let's pass that appropriation. When someone has said, well, what about the veterans' disability claims that are stacking up and are not being processed as a result of the shutdown? The House has passed legislation. We've come to the floor and offered that legislation which would allow us to address that problem. But we've been told no time and time again. Mr. President, I'd ask for a remaining 4 additional minutes by unanimous consent.
Without objection.
So we need to work together. That's the only way this is going to happen. And we know it will happen. It's going to happen. The President cannot take the unsustainable position that it's my way or the highway and I won't negotiate, especially since he's done it before, and especially since that's the only way our constitutional framework allows resolution of problems. If we were to do, which we're not going to do, what the President and the Majority Leader have asked us to do, which is to raise the debt limit automatically without dealing with any of our long-term fiscal problems, we will simply be encouraging Congress and other policymakers to delay tough choices and hard votes. We'll be encouraging, indeed we'll be enabling, the type of fiscal profligacy that has left us with a gross national debt of $17 trillion. About $53,000 for every man, woman, and child in America. Now, more than $6 trillion of debt has been added since President Obama became President of the United States. And yet the President seems to show absolutely no sense of urgency in dealing with it. That's despite his own fiscal commission, the Simpson-Bowles Commission, coming back in December of 2010. This was a bipartisan commission he himself appointed. And they came back with their own policy prescription to deal with this problem. Republicans, some of our most conservative members on the Senate side, some of the most liberal members on the other side of the aisle came together and they voted for the Simpson-Bowles Commission report in December 2010. But the President simply walked away from it. Back in March, he told ABC News, he said, "We don't have an immediate crisis in terms of debt. In fact, for the next 10 years, it's going to be in a sustainable place." That's what the President of the United States said last March. But that's not what his own bipartisan fiscal commission said in December 2010. And that's not what the Congressional Budget Office says. As everybody around here knows, the Congressional Budget Office is the final authority on these matters. In their 2013 long-term budget outlook, on page 13, they have a couple of pages here that I'd ask unanimous consent, Mr. President, be made part of the record following my remarks.
Without objection.
It's entitled Consequences of Large and Growing Federal Debt. They didn't say we don't have an immediate crisis in terms of debt, and we're pretty much in a sustainable place for 10 years. They said, quote, "The high and rising amounts of federal debt held by the public that CBO projects for the coming decades under extended baseline would have, quote, significant negative consequences for both the economy and the federal budget." What were those? They said, well, there'd be less national savings and less future income. They said there'd be pressure for larger tax increases and spending cuts to deal with this, and particularly the phenomenon of high interest payments that I mentioned a moment ago. Again, because of the Federal Reserve's policies, it costs next to nothing for the federal government in terms of interest on our national debt. But when that goes back up to their historic averages, 4 or 5%, it's going to cost trillions of dollars or more for us to service the existing debt, not to mention the additional trillion that the President wants to borrow. What crowd out other priorities? Things like NASA, which my colleague from Florida and I both think is an important national priority. And I heard the senator from Ohio say the same thing. But higher interest payments as a result of not dealing with this high debt is going to crowd out other important national priorities. And finally, the Congressional Budget Office said there's a greater chance of a fiscal crisis. Specifically, what they're talking about is as we pay more and more for interest on our national debt, we lose more and more control over our fiscal future. And as we all know, on a bipartisan basis, we've been told time and time again by the experts that this, when the public loses confidence, or I should say when our creditors lose confidence in our ability to repay our debt, there can become a breaking moment when all of a sudden we lose control and all of these things happen, which we can avoid if we deal responsibly today. So, Mr. President, in other words, the President seems content to let one of his successors deal with the problem of our rising national debt. And that's only, I would add, if we get lucky enough to postpone the kind of crisis and problems that the CBO projects, that Simpson-Bowles projects at that long. But the President obviously has other priorities. But I want to remind him what his own former chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Admiral Mike Mullen, said when he was asked about the nation's biggest threat to our national security. He said it was the national debt. The President himself has echoed those comments, but the President's still sitting on the sidelines and still takes the untenable position that he's unwilling to negotiate. At a time when the country needs genuine leadership, he's nowhere to be found. Until that changes, we're not going to get any closer to where we need to be sooner rather than later, and that's a true bipartisan compromise. Mr. President, I yield the floor.
Senator from Florida.
Mr. President, before you yield the chair, I just wanted to say that it's almost like deja vu all over again. The great senator from Maine was sitting in the chair only a couple of days ago when this senator had the chance to make comments. And here we are again. I want to say to the senator from Texas as he is leaving the chamber that I think he is a good senator and he believes strongly in what he's saying, but if there's a will, there's a way. Reasonable people can come together and work through to a reasonable conclusion. And I was going to say with the senator from Texas here on the floor that he had his chance to express his opinion. And indeed he did with his vote when we passed the appropriations bill, now called a continuing resolution because we haven't brought each of the appropriations bills to the floor. We accepted it at the House number. And the senior senator from Texas expressed his opinion by means of his no vote. But the yes votes won, and we sent it to the other body to keep the government open. And indeed, the government is not open. I go back to 2 days ago when the senator from Maine was the presiding officer, and here we are again talking about, you know, if we'd kind of remember the golden rule put in the Old English, do unto others as you would have them do unto you, or put in the modern street language, treat others as you want to be treated. In other words, recognize that the other fellow has a point of view, and you have to respect his point of view. And even though his point of view may be different from yours, the genius of American democracy is hammering out those differences and building consensus in a civil way and achieving a workable solution. But what we have here is brinkmanship. We hammer it out. We pass an appropriations continuing resolution. We send it down to the House of Representatives, and they don't get it up for a vote. Because there is what's operative, we're only going to pass this with Republican votes. So what does that do? That takes an outsized minority of the Republican caucus being the tail that is wagging the Republican dog in the House of Representatives. Because if you only pass it with Republican votes instead of the will of the whole House, then, in fact, you're going to have what we have now. A small, out-of-the-mainstream, political philosophy extremist group dictating what they want and only what they want. It's their way or no way. That's not treating others as you want to be treated. That's an attitude of saying, I know better than you and my way is going to be the only way. Well, that's not how we govern this country. And that's now how we honor and respect other people's point of view that may be different than ours. I didn't want to hold up the senator from Maine, but I just wanted to follow up to the conversation that I had through the chair 2 days ago. And before the senator leaves, I have 2 unanimous consent requests for committees to meet during today's session of the Senate. They have the approval of the majority and minority leaders. I ask consent that these requests be agreed to and that these requests be printed in the record.
Without objection.
Now, Mr. President, you know, all of this high-minded, highfalutin ideas of all of us getting together and treating each other as we want to be treated and hammering out this policy, lo and behold, maybe everything that I'm saying doesn't have a thing to do with this by virtue of an investigative piece having been done by the New York Times over the weekend. And I just want to read the first 3 paragraphs of this investigative piece. It's entitled, "A Federal Budget Crisis Months in the Planning." And, Mr. President, at the end of my remarks, I would ask consent that this be inserted in the record.
Without objection.
It's by Cheryl Gay Stolberg and Mike McIntyre. Shortly after President Obama started his second term, a loose-knit coalition of conservative activists led by former Attorney General Edwin Meese gathered in the Capitol to plot strategy. Their push to repeal Mr. Obama's health care law was going nowhere, and they desperately needed a plan. Out of that session, held one morning in a location the members insist on keeping secret, came a little noticed, quote, blueprint to defunding Obamacare, signed by Mr. Meese and the leaders of more than 36 conservative groups. It articulated a take no prisoners legislative strategy that has long percolated in conservative circles, that Republicans could derail the health care overhaul if conservative lawmakers were willing to push fellow Republicans, including their cautious leaders, into cutting off financing for the entire federal government. That's just the first 3 paragraphs, Mr. President. If that's true, then all these high-minded ideas of the golden rule and treating each other with respect and working out your differences, it's all out the window. And if that's true, and it looks like it is by virtue of what we see going on down in the other end of this Capitol building, where a small group of people are not going to do anything to open up the government unless they get their way to defund the Affordable Care Act, the health care reform bill. Now, I would suggest that if that's the case, then the people who are suffering should sit up and take notice of what is happening to their government. We've heard over and over examples out here. Senator Brown and I were just talking about the 97% of people that are laid off in NASA. And then when you do that with all of the civilian workforce of NASA, then just think what that's doing to all the contractors that work for NASA. You've heard also the statistic out here that over 70% of the intelligence community has been furloughed. You've heard out here that Head Start, the federally funded program to get children ready to start the public schools, kindergarten and the first grade, that's shutting down. You know that last week when we were in the middle of this shutdown, there was a storm brewing up down in the Gulf of Mexico. Thank the good Lord, it fizzled out, but at one point it was expected to turn into a Category 1 hurricane hitting the Gulf Coast. And had that happen, you know what? FEMA had been laid off, although they reached back and started National Guard, et cetera, et cetera. Thank goodness for Secretary of Defense Chuck Hagel finding an unintended consequence in the law that was passed to pay the United States military while the government shut down, because he found a little hook in there that, in fact, Mr. President, I ask 2 more minutes.